I was so stunned I could barely breathe at my own father's retirement party. My sister actually stood up and clapped when he slapped me in front of 60 people. The night was supposed to be perfect. A celebration filled with laughter, warmth, and love. A night to honor my father for his decades of hard work and to show him that his sacrifices had not been in vain. I had spent weeks planning every detail of his retirement party, determined to make it flawless. 60 guests filled our backyard, relatives, friends, and former colleagues, each dressed elegantly, sipping champagne under a canopy of golden fairy lights that twinkled against the night sky. Soft jazz played in the background, the scent of grilled food mingling with the sweet fragrance of garden roses. I had rented white chairs, a small stage, and even printed banners that read, "Congratulations, Richard, a legacy of dedication." My heart fluttered with anticipation, hoping that maybe tonight, my father would look at me with something other than cold indifference. Maybe tonight he would finally say, "I'm proud of you, Claire." As the evening went on, I busied myself with checking on the caterers and ensuring every guest had a drink in hand. My sister Emma, of course, floated among them like a celebrity, wearing her signature red dress that demanded attention. She laughed too loudly, spoke too proudly, and introduced herself as if she were the one being celebrated. That was Emma, confident, beautiful, and forever my father's favorite. Ever since we were little, she could do no wrong. I, on the other hand, was the one who had to earn every ounce of acknowledgement, every fleeting smile. But I didn't mind, not tonight. Tonight, I wanted to believe family meant forgiveness, that maybe the years of comparison and criticism would fade under the glow of fairy lights. When it was time for the speeches, I stood near the microphone, my palms sweating as I looked at the familiar faces before me. The chatter quieted. Dad sat at the center table beside Emma and Mom, his posture straight, his expression stoic as always. He had aged since his last birthday, his once dark hair now silver, his hands rough from decades of labor. I took a deep breath and began my speech, voice trembling slightly at first, but gaining confidence as I spoke. "Dad," I began, smiling softly, "tonight isn't just a celebration of your career. It's a celebration of who you are, of the man who taught us that hard work builds more than a living. It builds character." The crowd smiled. Some nodded. I could feel a rhythm forming in my words, my heart warming with pride. "You've been a role model to me in ways I can't describe. Even when we disagreed, I always admired your strength, your courage." A laugh cut through my words like a blade. It was sharp, mocking, unmistakably Emma's. "Strength and courage?" she scoffed, rolling her eyes. "Please, you mean control and stubbornness," the guests murmured. A few awkward chuckles escaped from one of the tables, unsure whether to laugh or not. My stomach twisted. "Emma," I said quietly, forcing a smile. "Please, can we not—" But she wasn't done. She leaned forward, her voice rising over the microphone. "Come on, Claire. You act like he's some hero. You just want attention, like always. You think organizing a party suddenly makes you a good daughter?" The words hit harder than I expected. My throat tightened and I felt my hands tremble again. I turned toward Dad, hoping he'd say something to stop her, to defend me. Instead, he was glaring, his jaw clenched, his eyes cold and sharp as ice. "Emma," Mom whispered, touching his arm. "Please, not here." But it was too late. Dad stood up so abruptly his chair screeched against the tiles. The music stopped. All eyes turned toward us. The fairy lights flickered above. And suddenly I wished the ground would swallow me whole. "What did I tell you about embarrassing this family?" Dad's voice thundered, echoing over the stunned silence. I blinked, confused, trying to understand what I had done wrong. "You never listen. You never learn when to stop talking." "Dad, I was just—" The slap came before I could finish. A single blistering sound that sliced through the night air. My face burned. My ears rang. The world tilted, and for a second I couldn't breathe. I touched my cheek, still warm from his hand, and looked at him in disbelief. The crowd froze. Someone gasped. Someone else muttered, "Oh my God." But the loudest sound wasn't the wind rustling through the trees or the clinking of a glass falling off a table. It was Emma, my sister. She clapped. She actually clapped, laughing so hard tears formed in her eyes. "Finally! Someone shut her up," she said between giggles. The humiliation was unbearable. My vision blurred as I stared at the faces around me, some filled with pity, others with discomfort, and a few trying to pretend they hadn't seen anything at all. My father stood there, his chest rising and falling with anger, while Emma smirked beside him like she had just won a prize. I wanted to scream, to ask them how they could do this to me in front of 60 people, but my voice wouldn't come. I felt like a child again, powerless, worthless. Mom tried to reach me, whispering, "Claire, please, sit down. Don't make it worse. Don't make it worse." That's what they always said whenever something happened. When Dad yelled, when Emma mocked, when I cried. Don't make it worse. As if silence were the solution, so I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I placed the microphone back on the stand, my fingers trembling, and whispered, "Excuse me." Then I turned and walked away, past the tables, past the whispers, past the shame. I could feel 60 eyes burning into my back, but I didn't stop. Outside, the air was cold and heavy. I stood by the garden gate, staring at the sky. My reflection in the window showed a red mark blooming across my cheek. My hands clenched, but I refused to let the tears fall. Inside, the party music resumed after a few awkward minutes as if nothing had happened. They could all pretend, but I couldn't. Something inside me had broken, and I knew there was no going back. I walked to my car, my heels clicking against the pavement, every step echoing in my chest like a heartbeat of rage. I could still hear Emma's laughter behind me, faint and cruel. For a long time, I sat in my car, staring blankly at the steering wheel. The city lights blurred through the windshield, and in that silence, I realized how much I had tolerated, how much I had swallowed in the name of family. Dad had always been hard on me. But that slap was more than discipline, it was rejection. And Emma's applause was betrayal. She had always loved seeing me small, unseen, unimportant. When we were children, she would take credit for my ideas, charm our parents into siding with her, and leave me to clean up the mess. Tonight was just a public version of what she had always done behind closed doors. My phone buzzed, Mom's name flashing across the screen. I let it ring. Then it rang again and again until finally I turned it off. I didn't owe them an explanation. I didn't owe them anything anymore. The drive home was a blur. My hands shook on the steering wheel. I thought of every time I had worked late to help Dad with his paperwork, every time I had defended Emma in front of her friends, every time I had stayed silent when I should have spoken. They didn't deserve my loyalty. They didn't even deserve my tears. By the time I reached my apartment, my face had dried, but my heart hadn't. I sat on my bed, staring at the dark window, hearing echoes of that slap in my mind. My cheek still ached, but the real pain was deeper, buried under years of trying to be enough. That night, I made a silent promise. Not of revenge, not yet, but of transformation. They would see me differently one day. Not as the fragile, obedient daughter or the quiet sister, but as the one who finally stood on her own. As dawn crept through the blinds, painting the room in pale gold, I touched my cheek once more. The redness had faded, but the memory wouldn't. I realized something crucial. The slap wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the applause. The betrayal in my sister's hands echoes through the night, and that sound, that cruel clapping would stay with me, guiding every decision, every choice, every quiet step I'd take from that day forward. It was the moment I stopped seeking their approval and started building my own strength brick by brick. It was the night I learned that silence, when used right, could be louder than any slap. The days after the party felt like a blur, soaked in humiliation. Each morning I woke up to the same burning sting on my cheek, though the redness had faded. The echo of that slap haunted me like a song I couldn't turn off, looping endlessly in my head. My father's voice thundered in my memory, and worse, Emma's laughter layered over it like cruel applause. I'd thought sleep would wash it away, but even in dreams I stood before that crowd again, frozen, powerless, small. By the third night, I packed my things. I couldn't stay in that house, surrounded by the walls that had witnessed my silence for years. I left behind the pink room I'd grown up in. The floral curtains my mother insisted were sweet and feminine, and the photos of a smiling family that never truly existed. I rented a small apartment on the west side of town, a one-bedroom above a laundromat, the kind of place that always smelled faintly of detergent and rain. It wasn't much, but it was mine. For the first time in years, I didn't have to walk on eggshells. No judgmental eyes, no sharp words waiting to pierce me. Just quiet. But quiet isn't always peaceful. Sometimes silence has weight. It presses down on your chest and forces you to face every thought you tried to bury. To distract myself, I picked up long shifts at a small cafe downtown. The manager, a kind woman named Lila, hired me after a single interview. I started working late nights, wiping counters and steaming milk until my hands ached. The smell of roasted coffee clung to my clothes and hair, but I didn't care. It kept me busy, and busy was better than broken. Customers came and went, and though some smiled politely, I preferred the ones who didn't talk. I didn't want to explain why a woman with a degree and a near-perfect resume was wiping tables at midnight. Sometimes, I'd catch a glimpse of myself in the cafe's glass door, eyes hollow, face pale, hair tied back carelessly, and I barely recognized the woman staring back. I wasn't the Claire who planned parties, who believed that love and loyalty could fix anything. That version of me had died under those fairy lights the moment Dad's hand met my cheek. Days turned into weeks, and though my body moved through routines, my mind stayed trapped in that moment. The shame followed me like a shadow. I avoided calls, ignored texts, and deleted social media. But gossip travels fast, and soon, whispers reached even the cafe. One of the regulars, an old family acquaintance, looked at me with thinly veiled pity. "I heard about what happened," she said softly, stirring her tea. "You poor thing." I forced a smile and muttered that I was fine. But inside I burned. Poor thing. That's what they all thought of me. A victim of my father's temper and my sister's cruelty. No one saw the truth. I wasn't broken. I was waiting. Then one quiet afternoon, everything changed. It was my day off, and I was sitting at the small kitchen table in my apartment, scrolling aimlessly through job listings when my email pinged. The subject line read, "Congratulations on a memorable night, Mr. Collins." I frowned. Mr. Collins had worked with my father for years, one of his oldest business partners. Why would he email me? I clicked it open. The message was polite, almost cheerful, thanking me for organizing such a graceful and well-executed event for my father's retirement. Attached were several photographs from that evening, taken by the event photographer. I hesitated before downloading them, unsure if I wanted to see those faces again. But curiosity won. At first, the images were harmless. People laughing, my father shaking hands, Emma posing beside him with her champagne glass raised. But then one photo caught my attention. It showed my father in deep conversation with a man I didn't recognize, their expressions serious. The stranger was handing him a slim folder. Another photo taken from across the table showed Emma holding that same folder later, slipping it discreetly under the table toward Dad. Zooming in, I could barely make out the words on the folder. Bid proposal, future expansion. My heart pounded. What was Emma doing handling business documents at Dad's retirement party? The folder didn't belong there. It wasn't part of any official company project. I remembered overhearing snippets of conversation between them months ago, words like approval, permits, and expansion zones. Back then, I hadn't cared. I thought it was just business talk. But now, the memory felt sharp, suspicious. I saved the photo to my laptop and stared at it for nearly an hour. The uneasy feeling in my gut grew stronger. That night, as rain tapped against my window, I made a decision. I picked up my phone and called Daniel, a friend from university who now worked in the city's planning department. We hadn't spoken in years, but if anyone could tell me what future expansion meant, it was him. He answered after 2 rings. Claire? Wow, it's been forever. What's up? Hey, Daniel, I said, forcing calm into my voice. I need a favor. It's about some business contracts my dad might be involved in. Could you check something for me? Discreetly? He hesitated, then chuckled. That sounds suspicious already. I know. Just, please. It's important, he sighed. All right. Send me whatever you have. Within 10 minutes, I emailed him the photos and a brief note explaining what I'd seen. Then I waited. The hours crawled by. By midnight, I had convinced myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe Emma was just helping Dad with paperwork. But then my phone buzzed again. Claire, Daniel said, his tone low and serious. You didn't get these photos from me, understand? My chest tightened. Okay, what did you find? Your father's company filed several construction bids last quarter under different names. The same office address, but different business registrations. All will be approved by the city within weeks. That doesn't happen without influence. And guess what? Each of those companies is linked to a shell account under someone named Emma Richards. Emma. My sister. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. Are you saying they're laundering money? I'm saying they're manipulating city contracts for personal gain. Claire, this is serious. If someone looks closer, they're both going down. I thanked him quietly and hung up, my hand trembling as I set the phone down. My mind spun. All those years Dad lectured me about integrity, about being a disgrace to the family for choosing art over business. And yet, he was the real fraud. And Emma, of course, she was part of it. She wasn't just his golden child. She was his partner in crime. The humiliation at that party suddenly made sense. They'd turned on me not just because they could, but because I was an outsider, because I didn't belong in their little empire built on lies. I couldn't sleep that night. I sat by the window, the city lights blurring through my tears, and thought about every time they'd made me feel small. Every dinner where Dad criticized me for being too emotional. Every time Emma whispered that I'd never succeed. Every moment I stayed quiet because I wanted peace. I realized that my silence had protected them. I'd been their shield, absorbing the blows, the blame, the shame. And they'd mistaken that silence for weakness. But they were wrong. The next morning, I printed every photo and document Daniel sent me. I placed them neatly in a folder, labeling it insurance. I wasn't sure what I would do with it yet, but holding those papers gave me a strange sense of power. For the first time, the balance had shifted. They didn't know I knew, and that was an advantage I'd never had before. I spent the next few days gathering more information quietly. I scrolled through public records, old company announcements, and anything that connected Emma and Dad to those fake businesses. Each discovery felt like another puzzle piece snapping into place. They'd been doing this for years, profiting off insider knowledge, bribing officials, disguising it all as family expansion projects. One night, as I organized the papers on my kitchen table, I found myself smiling, not out of joy but out of clarity. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about justice. About finally exposing the people who believed they could destroy anyone who stood in their way. Still, a part of me hesitated. They were my family, my blood. Could I really turn them in? Could I live with myself after that? But then I remembered the slap, the laughter, the humiliation, the way 60 people watched and did nothing while my sister clapped. I remembered the girl I was that night, broken, trembling, and alone, and I realized something simple and cold. They'd already destroyed our family. All I'd be doing now is finishing what they started. That night, I placed the folder back in the drawer and turned off the light. The room was quiet, but it wasn't suffocating anymore. It was the kind of silence that feels like the calm before a storm I was ready to bring. As I lay in bed, one thought echoed in my mind, sharp, clear, undeniable. They thought my silence meant surrender, but they'd forgotten that silence could also mean strategy, and this time, I wouldn't just survive their cruelty, I would end it. With one quiet call. The night I placed the call, my hands were steady even though my heart hammered like a drum in my ribs. I sat at my kitchen table with the folder of papers spread out under the yellow lamp and dialed the anonymous corruption hotline number Daniel had whispered to me. And when a calm, recorded voice answered, I swallowed whatever last thread of fear I had left and read aloud every detail I had collected. The strange shell companies, the contractor names that repeated across different bids, the dates, the photograph files, the emails where Emma's name appeared in the margins, the scanned invoices that didn't match the work that had been done. And I uploaded everything to a secure address they gave me, watching the progress bar crawl across my laptop like a small, deliberate heartbeat. I did not beg. I did not ask for vengeance. I handed over truth, and that felt like a prayer. After I hung up, the apartment hummed with a heavy sort of peace. It was the kind of peace that follows a decision, the kind that makes you dizzy because you realize you've just moved the world a few inches. I slept poorly, as if my muscles and breath were getting used to a new rhythm. But when morning came, the first ripple had already begun. A private investigator with a municipal badge left a message on my phone asking if I could come in to answer a few questions. And when I walked into the downtown office, he was quieter and more professional than I'd expected, dressed in a plain shirt with a tie tucked into his belt. And he asked for copies of everything I had and for my recollection of dates and places. I told him the truth. And because I had been patient and meticulous in my days of gathering and labeling, because I'd stamped file names and preserved email headers, his questions were short and precise. Within days, the kind of administrative machinery that eats away at illusions began to move. Subpoenas quietly slid across desks. Accounts were temporarily frozen while auditors combed through records. The city permit office reopened old files, and the contractor who had smiled with my father in those retirement photos suddenly found compliance officers in his office asking pointed questions about payments. It felt strange and surreal to watch the dominoes fall in places I'd never imagined I could reach. There were moments when I wanted to run back to the house and tell them exactly what I knew. To see the look on Emma's face, to see whether Dad's chest would still be so firm under humiliation. But I clamped down on that instinct. If there was anything I'd learned in the week since the slap, it was that patience amplified truth. News traveled in uneasy arcs. First the internal memos that never quite left the company, then a headline on a local business site, and finally a reporter's message through a contact I hadn't permitted to talk. Because once the official investigators had the files, the press found its way in. I watched through the cafe window one morning as a reporter's van idled 2 doors down, while my manager Lila went to the door with a tray of coffee and shook her head. When the story broke in the afternoon, local construction network under investigation for bid rigging, I sat on the floor of my tiny apartment and let the words wash over me like cold water. My father's name was not in the headline at first, just the company's, but within 48 hours, the official complaint was filed and names followed like loose coins spilling from a knocked-over jar. The city announced an ongoing investigation, and a press release mentioned several individuals of interest, one of whom was my sister, Emma Richards. The shock on my mother's face when the first news alert popped up on her phone felt like the echo of the slap, turned inward and multiplied. She called me that night, voice wavering between panic and pleading, asking me if I had said anything, if I had gone to the press. "Claire, you must tell me if you did this," she begged, and I lied by omission, because the power of what I had done was not in the confession, but in the fact that the truth was now moving through official channels where it could not be softened with family excuses when investigators visited the family home to request documents. Dad's posture changed in ways I recognized from a childhood of watching his pride take hit after hit. He tried to keep the face he always wore to public meetings, composed, in control, but I saw the tightness at his jaw, the way his hands went to his pockets as if searching for the steadying mechanisms of his life. Emma, who had once clapped as if the world were applause and not consequence, was arrested quietly one gray morning. 2 officers at the front door, A polite explanation from an officer who looked tired and a little sorry, her arms cuffed, and a sob that sounded less like surprise than like the final unraveling of someone who had thought herself immune. It was not a spectacle. There were no dramatic shouts or running after the car, but the neighbors who had once waved at garden parties watched from behind curtains. And the image of Emma in a sweater too small for the situation, her hair loose and the makeup running from rushed fingers, would haunt me less for its victory than for its sadness. Later, when charges were formally filed, the news shows replayed clips of the retirement party. Viewers could see my face in the background, the microphone in the stand, Emma's laugh caught in an unflattering freeze frame, and strangers messaged me with a strange mixture of sympathy and congratulation, as if the humiliation I'd endured had been currency they could spend on private praise. People began to call, the company's clients, old friends of Dad who now felt obliged to distance themselves, the contractor whose permits were under audit, and the family's social circle thinned like a cloth after too many washings. Mom stopped answering her phone. She would later tell me, through a lawyer and with trembling dignity, that she did not know what her husband had been involved in, that she had been kept from the ledgers and the late-night calls. But the way she looked at me when our eyes met across the courthouse hallways said more than words. Betrayal had bloomed in both directions. I never sought to break her. I could see the conflict in her face, love and loyalty clashing with the raw disbelief of having been deceived. And I felt grief for her because, in the end, she too was caught in the net of a life she thought she led honestly. Dad, when he was called to testify as the investigation widened, attempted to mount a defense rooted in plausible deniability, blaming poor bookkeeping and a trusted employee, but the trail led to emails and meeting notes and transfers whose signatures were unmistakable. The auditors had been meticulous, and my folder of evidence, combined with municipal records and a few brave whistleblowers, made for a case that was harder to dismiss than the family myth had been. Watching him in that courtroom, older, smaller in the fluorescent lights, his hands folded and no longer steady, felt like watching a construction I had revered collapse under its own rot. There were nights the thought of Emma sitting in a cell made me feel sharp and cold with triumph. And there were other nights when I sat with the ledger copies spread on my kitchen table and felt the heavy, ethical weight of what I'd done. I had torn open a wound in my family that might never fully close. What comfort there was came not from headlines or the slow turnover of corporate boards, but from the small, private moments when people who had watched me leave the party came forward with stories of similar humiliations. Or when a neighbor dropped off a pie and left a note that said simply, "You were brave." I learned quickly and painfully that justice is not synonymous with joy. The closure I sought was quieter than celebration. I did not attend Emma's arraignment in person. I did not want to see the rawness of her face up close. Instead, I sent one message, terse and cold in its economy. "Thanks for the applause. I couldn't have done it without your attention." It was a small line, snapped like a twig, and it arrived at her phone as she sat in an interview room under fluorescent lights. I did not expect her to answer. She didn't. That silence was cleaner than any apology she might have offered. As the criminal case unfolded over months, lawyers circled like vultures, and family friends retreated into statements and a curated silence. The business was dismantled. Contracts were rescinded. Restitution was discussed in dry legalese. Occasionally, a journalist would reach me for comment, and I gave measured replies, never gloating, always factual, because I realized that my narrative no longer belonged fully to me. It was now tangled with interviews, affidavits, public hearings, and the quiet suffering of employees who lost jobs when accounts were frozen. I tried to keep that in mind. The ripple effect of exposing the truth sometimes washes innocent things away with the guilty. People who had worked for Dad were suddenly unemployed, and some of them looked at me with thin, puzzled anger. They had loved him in their way, and in their grief, I could not be a simple heroine. That complexity kept me humble. When the dust settled enough for the legal system to hand down sentences, the outcome was not theatrical. Emma received probation and community service after a plea deal that spared her more time in exchange for cooperation. Dad faced fines and a suspended sentence contingent on restitution and public apology, a tawdry sort of public reckoning that left him with less than the austere dignity he had once cultivated. They were punished in ways that law allowed, but the real punishment, the dismantling of their social standing, the quiet late-night conversations about what it means to be trustworthy, lasted longer and felt more like an erosion than a strike. I moved through those months with caution and a strange new clarity. I reclaimed old friendships, enrolled in night classes to finish the degree my parents had mocked me for pursuing, and let myself be known by people who cared for me without the layers of familial expectation. Revenge, I discovered, was a poor teacher for the things that actually heal you. It teaches a single, sharp lesson and leaves you to build the rest. What healed me was not the sight of Emma subdued, or Dad's tone softened. It was the gradual filling in of my days with honest labor. The little orders at the cafe where regulars began to smile for reasons that had nothing to do with scandal. The late-night classes where I surprised myself with my own persistence. I volunteered at a legal aid clinic, offering administrative help to people who couldn't afford representation. There, I met women quietly rebuilding their lives after being betrayed by people they trusted, and their small successes felt like a balm on the long sting of what had happened to me. Once, months later, my mother and I walked through a museum and stood a long time in front of a painting of a storm-tossed sea. She reached for my hand without asking, and when I squeezed back, something in me that had been kept under careful lock finally loosened. Not forgiveness exactly. Too much had broken for that, but a tentative truce, born of exhaustion and the recognition that we were both, in different ways, survivors. In the quiet aftermath, friends would sometimes ask if I regretted that one quiet call. I never gave them the simple answer they wanted. I said instead that I had no regret for choosing truth over subservience, because the price of silence had become too high. The cost of staying small had been myself. The party under the fairy lights had felt like the last chance to please them, but the call I made afterward was the first act that pleased me. I kept the folder of documents in a locked box for a long time, not out of fear, but out of respect for what it represented. Proof that things can be changed, that what looks untouchable is often only so because no one dares to look. And sometimes, when I sat in the quiet of my apartment and listened to the hum of the city, I would think of the slap and the clap and the strange arithmetic of consequence, how a single impulsive act in the light of 60 people had set in motion a sequence that a soft, anonymous voice at the end of a line could complete. The world had not been made perfect. My family was not wholly mended, but one quiet call had shifted the center of gravity in my life. It gave me a language for power that did not require me to raise my voice or lower my standards, and in that new grammar, I found the steadiness to keep walking forward.